The wind rolled across the mesas like a living spirit, whispering through dry sagebrush and painting long shadows over crimson rock as Cole. Maddox reined in his chestnut, Mare at the border of Apache country, a land most settlers only spoke of with trembling superstition. He was a drifter by birth, a ranch hand by profession, and a man who had never bent his knee for anything except prayer and a kind-hearted woman who had once looked at him like the sun was rising from his eyelashes until the fever took her and left. His world hollowed, cracked, like a rattlesnake's discarded skin. Years later, with only his rifle, his mare, and the memory of a broken promise to live a life worth living, he came upon a smoldering fire and a gathering of Apache women, guarded not by bullets, but by the air of ancient law. And there she was, Nalin, the quiet-eyed healer whose voice was gentle even when she spoke like thunder, telling him that her village was dying of drought and sickness, and he, the wandering cowboy, was the only outsider they trusted enough to ask for help because he had once saved an Apache child from a mining company's greed, riding 30 miles with the boy bleeding on his saddle. When Cole spoke to her, it was like his lungs remembered how to breathe, and when she asked him why he kept returning to their lands, he said he was searching for something he couldn't name, something like mercy in a world that chewed men like tobacco. One dusk, beneath the painted sky, Nalin's oldest sister, Taklashim, approached him with an expression that would stop a charging stallion, her hair braided with eagle feathers, her arms crossed as she said, "Cowboy, if you want to marry our sister, then by sacred law you must satisfy the sisters first." And though his heart hammered like gunfire, he answered with the humility of a man who understood nothing except that he cared for Nalin. So he asked, trembling slightly, "What does that mean?" As he braced himself, and the sisters exchanged looks not of lust, but of judgment, because the test was not the body, it was the soul. The first sister led him at dawn into the desert, where the sun burned like an anvil overhead, and she handed him a worn bow that had belonged to her father, saying he must bring meat for the elders without killing more than he needed, for greed was a sin to the earth. And Cole rode out, thus choking his throat, until he found a herd of deer grazing under a lonely cottonwood, where he drew the bow, heart heavy with the memory of a wife he couldn't save, and he whispered apology before he loosed the arrow. The deer fell quickly, without suffering, and he knelt to thank its spirit, as he had seen the Apache do. And when he returned with meat enough for 3 families, and not a scrap more, Taklashim's stern eyes softened, though her lips said nothing. The second sister, Ayana, the warrior, whose body bore scars like poems burned into skin, took him to the edge of the canyon at twilight and demanded he prove he wouldn't abandon Nalin when the world turned cruel, because the last white man who courted their sister vanished when drought struck, leaving her crying into empty skies. So Cole was given no words to plead, only actions. She struck him with a wooden staff again and again until his arms bruised, again until his lips split and the taste of iron rose in his mouth, again until his knees shook like a colt's. And each time he staggered she barked, "Stand up, cowboy," and each time he rose, not because he knew how to win, but because he refused to lose the moment he finally found someone who believed he could be more than a man. Running from ghosts, finally she stopped, panting, and told him, "You bleed well, but bleeding is easy, staying is hard." And they walked back in silence beneath a night sky so vast it made him feel like a child, staring into God's eyes. But it was the youngest sister, Kaya, who tested him last and hardest, not with violence nor hunting, but with something far heavier, community. She led Cole to the grandmother lodge, where old women whispered over steaming bowls of herbs. And there he spent 3 days tending the sick, grinding roots into medicine, and comforting children who clung to his sleeves as if he were a returning father. They asked him why settlers hated them, why the cavalry burned their crops, why white men carved scars into their land. And Cole, throat tight, simply said, "Some men don't see souls when they look at others." And an elder, her face wrinkled like dried bark, touched his cheek and told him she had seen his heart the moment he crossed their border, because only men seeking redemption rode alone into sacred territory without a gun drawn. When the third night fell, Nalin stepped into the firelight, dressed not as a maiden to be taken, but as a woman of her people, painted with symbols of hope. and she asked him if he would stay even when drought came, even when soldiers rode, even when the world demanded he choose a side. His voice cracked when he swore that he would not only stay, he would defend them like he once defended the dying boy, and the sisters, one by one, encircled him, chanting words older than the railroad tracks and older than the gun he carried, welcoming him not just as a husband-to-be, but as a man reborn into responsibility. In the days that followed, Cole worked beside them to dig new irrigation trenches, rode through mountains to trade pelts for medicine, built a shelter reinforced with cedar, and for the first time since his wife's death, he felt something like dawn in his chest. Yet peace in the West was fragile as a glass saddle, and when a band of railroad men arrived, claiming the land under fraudulent papers, Cole stood in front of them alone, coat swaying, rifle slung low, telling them that this valley was protected by people with roots deeper than steel. And when one man laughed and cocked his gun, Cole shot the revolver clean from his hand before the man blinked. The sound like thunder cracking dry earth. The railroad men fled, swearing they'd return with soldiers, but the sisters stood beside him, unafraid, and Nalin rested her hand on his shoulder, whispering that sometimes sacred law was not about tests. It was about becoming worthy of others' love. As the summer faded and new rains came, Cole Maddox, once a ghost wandering the prairie, became a pillar of their community, raising crops, tending fires, and learning the language of her people, not as a borrowed culture but as a shared destiny. And when the marriage ceremony came, there was no church, no preacher, only the sisters, the elders, the land, and the cowboy who had passed every trial not with fists or pride, but by healing wounds older than his own. They stood around him, eyes shining like stars reflected in canyon pools, and Nalin spoke one word, home, and it was then he understood that satisfying the sisters had never been about conquering them, but earning their trust, honoring their lineage, and proving that love was not possession, but service. And as the night winds roared and the drums thumped like steady heartbeats, Cole lifted his gaze to the heavens and silently thanked whatever force of nature or God or fate had delivered him to the one place on earth he belonged, knowing that from that day forward he was no longer a drifter or widow, but a husband, a protector, and a man whose name carried not fear, but respect.